Thank you. And if somebody is wondering why I like deep sea fishing, it's because a lot of times you don't have to sit around for hours. You just cast and catch, right? I'm not one of those all day fisherman type guys. Let me see if I can share the presentation. Okay, I'm hoping that you all are seeing my presentation here. Okay.
Yes.
So when I was asked to put a topic together for this group, I kind of struggled a little bit what I can talk about when it comes to resilience. But I've done a couple of presentations on generations, and I know if you look at a workplace current state, generations is one of those topics that not it's not discussed as often, but has a very big impact in the workplace. So before we get into that, let's make sure a level set on leadership, right? That there's a leader and then there's a manager. For me, leadership, and then this is a definition, and I'll provide the sources for this. Individual that has the ability to influence, motivate, and enable others to contribute towards organizational success. And the key piece in the leadership is that the influence and the motivation. And then you tack on the resilience part of it. What makes a leader resilient, right? A leader that sees failures as a temporary setback and can recover from that quickly. And then I think being in to some degree talked about COVID was one of those big setbacks for a lot of leaders. They had to learn how to manage people remotely if they were used to that management by walking around. And you had to figure out how do you create productivity without seeing people every day. And a lot of people succeeded if they were resilient leaders, and some struggled if they lacked that capability to have a positive attitude and a strong sense of opportunity in the times of turbulence. Being a renovator myself, one of the examples I have of, I guess you can call it resiliency, is I was in the bathroom one day, remodeling the bathroom, and I'm pulling the sink. And if you've done any remodel, there's points of frustration. And I pulled the sink and it pulled all the piping and broke the pipe, and there was water shooting up in the air. And I just reflex, just plugged the hole with my thumb and just sat there for a little bit trying to figure out, okay, what do we do now? I can let this keep going and flood the house, and that'll be a very costly renovation, or I need to figure out how to fix it. So I finally figured out I could get my wife to get me a hose. I'd stick it on that pipe, tie it up on that pipe, and stick the hose out the window. And luckily that ended up working. So to me, resiliency is replacing if with the how. And that gets your brain kind of coming up with thoughts on how you can fix it versus dwelling on the misfortune or the turbulence or the incident that you've run into. So when I'm talking about generations in the workplace, studies have been done on this, and this started in the 90s when the millennials came into the workplace. Um, the biggest challenge to management, training, and leadership in the workplace is generations. Whether you know about it or not, that's the biggest challenge that the workplaces have. And a lot of it comes from some managers have this concept of the employee should learn the manager versus the manager learning the employee, right? So there's a dynamic there where you're bringing a new generation that doesn't have that, as a matter of fact, respect for your manager, where you're having to learn that you have to show respect to them for them to respect you back. You have to actually learn how they learn before you can teach them something. So there's those dynamics in the workplace that create a lot of challenges that some companies are struggling with, and some just haven't taken time to even look into it. So not to assume that everybody here knows what we're talking about when we're talking about generations. I'm not talking about, of course, family tree generations. I'm talking about cultural generations. And By the way, kind of to dial back a little bit, I'm from Kenya, right? This is not an East Texas accent. So I'm first generation from Kenya. And when I talk about generation, this is going to be applying to the United States. So if you're first generation here as well, some of these things might not resonate, but the studies that have been done here are mostly in the United States. So, but the generation aspect of it applies everywhere. It might be different years, it might be different timings, different population, but generations is everywhere. But for this respective presentation, I'm talking about the United States generations. So back in the 19th century, some researchers determined that people that grew in a certain period of time had a common distinctive behavioral trait that described how they looked at different things, how they looked at the world, how they looked at the workplace, how they looked at management, bosses, and all of that, that shaped how they went through life, right? So, for example, for you all that know the twist, right? Some people used to think that's a pretty cool dancing style, right? The twist. And now with TikTok, I don't even know what the new dancing style is, right? But how you grow up shapes how you look at life. And that comes into the workplace. So generations really, that 7 to 18 years of your life, where your they call it your formative years, you start developing a sense of self, a sense of how you look at everything, and it shapes your life from there on. It doesn't mean that you don't change, but it's a big impact of how you go through life. And for the purposes of painting a better picture of what the generations I'm talking about are, this is the 5 different generations that you have in the workplace, right? You have your traditionalist, your baby boomers. I think everybody probably knows baby boomers. Your Gen X's, your millennial Gen Y, your net generation, and Gen Z, as some others might call it. And you could see kind of those age those years that they fall into. And these are not static years. Some researchers might move the traditionalists to the 1920s or 1930s, but kind of the grouping is essentially somewhere in there in the same. And when I looked at this, I started looking at the traditionalist and thinking, there's probably somewhere you have a 76-plus-year-old person still working, right? And imagine if you're 76 years old and you're trying to figure out somebody that's just 21 years getting into the workplace. That's the dynamic I'm talking about. There's a lot of differences between a baby boomer and a Gen Z. And if you don't take time to look into it or to learn those differences, you can lose your worker that could have been a really good contributor to the workplace because you didn't take time to learn it. There's a lot of traits that are tied to each generation that I shared in my presentation. For example, the boomers have been looked at as they're loyal to their employer, they're hardworking. Your Gen X's, they're also known as the latchkey kids, right? This is the first generation that saw a lot of divorces, and both parents worked. So they had the key to the house. They'd come home and make a sandwich for themselves. So they call them the latchkey kids, right? The millennials or the Gen Y, you're looking at the 80s and the 90s, tech savvy, ambitious, confident. This is the generation that came into the workplace that they didn't really buy the thought that you needed to work in the trenches. You need to earn your keep or something of that sort. This is the generation that they came into the workplace and they asked questions. They didn't, not like the older generations where they were supposed to be quiet. You're here to be seen until you've earned the right to speak. No, day one, they start questioning things, right? And then, of course, the Gen Z or the net generation, this is the latest generation that's coming into the workplace. That I guess the best example I'll give you, or the best thing I read on this generation, is they look at connectivity, the internet, as part of kind of the essentials, right? You have food, water, clothing, transportation, internet, right? So they value connectivity quite a bit. I remember when I started working for the company, at some point they had thought about should we block Facebook and all these sites and Yahoo and all of that? I think for this generation, the Gen Z, if you did that, you probably wouldn't have anybody working at your company without any sort of connectivity to the outside world. So when you look at the generations in a workplace, back in 95, you had baby boomers were close to 50%, if not more, of the workplace. And you had your Gen Xers at 31% and your traditionalists around 18%. Fast forward 20 years, you have a brand new generation that came into the workplace and is now a third of that workplace, right? That's a big shift. And then by 2025, which is now 10 years, you will have a brand new generation that's going to be a third of the workforce. And now you're going into where you're having 5 generations in the workplace. So there's a lot of dynamics taking place that from a leadership or management standpoint, you have to be cognizant of it and how you navigate through that dynamic of the different generations. So how do generational differences affect the workplace? This quote really, I mean, it resonates. It doesn't care. I don't think anybody can dispute this, right? Each generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. So bring that to the workplace, right? The new employee coming into the workplace, they know that they have access to technology, they have access to real-time information. And if you look at the millennials and the Gen Zs, they're the most educated generation getting into the workplace. I think the baby boomers were, if you look at the college degree or higher, they were probably in the 20, 30%. This generation is much higher than that. So they know they're highly educated. They know they're tech savvy and they can get information much quicker. And I'll tell you, a majority of them look at themselves as probably more intelligent than the generation that they're finding in a workplace, because they're having to go from brand new employee to a very experienced senior employee within 3 years, compared to the prior generations that had to go through some sort of apprenticeship process and had enough time to maybe 5 or even sometimes 10 years to become a senior employee that could be essentially cut loose to do, and to do all the work. And that dynamic can be challenging for an older generation that's in the workplace. So just so you know that this generational, looking at the younger generation as maybe spoiled, or they don't want to pay their dues, it's not something new. When you look at this quote, you would think this was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's a really old quote, right? So the generational dynamics have been there for a long time. The difference is you're going from where you used to have 2, maybe 3 generations in a workplace to where now you're having 4 or 5 generations in a workplace. And you can tell that difference between the older generation and the younger generation. So the key piece of this for me, the question that came to mind is, how do you manage the different generations, right? What is it as a manager that you need to do to be able to manage the different generations? And if you go to a lot of workplaces, there's a lot of baby boomers that are leaving the workplace, and you're getting a lot of millennials that are getting into those positions. So for example, for me, and the reason this topic was really resonated with me was when I got my first job, when I got my first manager position, I was 27 years old. I started managing a work group where all the employees had been working in that department longer than I'd been alive, right? The least experienced employee in that work group had 30 years of experience. So you bring this 27-year-old, you plug him into a management position, and you're asking them to manage employees that have done the work that they're doing longer than that employee has been, than their manager has been alive, right? So that was a very intimidating thing for me. And some of the things I did, I incorporated into this. The biggest one is be an active listener, right? I like a quote that I've used here before, I've heard it before, is your ears will never get you in trouble, right? So you have to you have to listen to them. You have to understand their frustrations. You have to remember that success requires you to truly know what they do, how they do it, what struggles they've had in the past, and how you, as, to be honest, an inexperienced person that's managing the work group, can actually help them succeed, right? And don't come in with some sort of youthful enthusiasm. They've probably, in 30 years, they've seen it all. So you have to take time to listen, have the candid conversations with the group before you start providing some direction, providing some effort or some help. The next one is get to know them on a personal level. I used to just sit in a room and just talk about, hey, tell me a story about how you came up, how you got this job, just getting to know them and knowing how they got to where they are and some of the things they've seen along the way kind of helps them earn that respect for you. And kind of the interest in their history and incorporating some of that into some of your decision making. And something else you have to be also cognizant of as you're getting to know them is some of them might have been passed on for the job that you got, right? They might have looked at themselves as more qualified to get your job, but you got it. So you have to be cognizant of that and just take time to know them and work through those dynamics of knowing that it's not going to be day one that you're going to have a big impact with somebody that's an older generation. The other one is blend old ways with new ways, right? Like I said, somebody that's been at a place for 30 years, they've seen a few really good ideas fail. So try to learn the old ways and some of the things that have been tried before you start implementing your innovative ideas, right? And invite them to the table. Talk about, here's what I think of doing. I'd like to get your wisdom or to get your input on how we can make this a success. Earn respect and by being less authoritative, right? As a younger manager, it's really hard for you to succeed with the older generation by being authoritative. The older generation has respect for the position. That's something I've learned. They have respect for the position, but they could lose respect for you if your go-to management mode or leadership mode is authoritative, right? So you have to earn their respect. Don't exercise your authority unless it's absolutely necessary, right? Let your leadership or that respect for you be organic by what you do rather than just defaulting to your authoritative. Be honest and recognize the obvious. There's some things you're not gonna know because you haven't worked there long enough, right? So don't be one of those people that you were brought here to fix it kind of know-it-all person. Acknowledge the things you don't know and invite them to the table to talk about how they can help you succeed or they can help the work group succeed with resolving those issues. Stand firm and don't play games even when intimidated. So not every older generation person that's in your work group is going to give you the goodwill, right? Some of them might challenge your leadership style. Some of them might look at that one instance where you're wrong and try, I call it see blood in the water, and try to intimidate you or try to make you look bad. That's when you have to stand on the authoritative side that you've gotten in that position, and you have to stand firm. It doesn't mean stick with it because with the wrong decision, but you have to stand firm. You have to bring up that they could be part of the solution or they could be part of the problem. And in most cases, sometimes you have to have those conversations in private. You have to invite this older employee into your office and talk about candidly how it appeared that they were being disrespectful, right? Having those conversations will help create that credibility rather than you cowering away or trying to deflect. Acknowledge experience. And I've talked about this on some of the other bullets, right? Another way of acknowledging experience would be creating a mentorship program. Looking at somebody that's done their job for 30 years and you're getting a new employee that's a brand new employee, and creating an explicit mentorship program where you're talking to the older employee or to the tenured employee and asking them to mentor the younger employee so that they can succeed in that workplace. And be clear of your expectations, right? Sit down with all employees, actually, for that matter, but specifically the older generation employee, and make sure you level set on what the expectations are. Some of the things I've done here was I just asked the employee, if you don't mind, I'd like you to tell me what is it that you would do that at the end of the year, I could say you are an excellent performer. And what are those priorities that you have within your job that would make you an excellent performer? And if those priorities that they have are different from what you have, that's when you get to level set, right? When you start off with just writing a bunch of stuff for an older employee, it's more like you're telling them what to do. If you invite them to tell you, hey, what is it that you can do that from my standpoint as your manager, I would say you knocked it out the park. Let them come up with that list. And if there's something that needs to be added onto it, have that discussion. So before I go to the managing the younger generation, and this is where face-to-face works better, to Bing's point, right? So when you look at this picture, what do you see, right? A lot of you are looking at it, well, I have two employees that are paying attention, and I have a millennial or a Gen Z over there texting. The story here is, as a leader, don't assume. I remember when I first got my management job, we were in a leadership development meeting, and I was typing notes, listening and typing notes on the computer. And at the end of the meeting, the presenter, who was another senior manager, asked, "Can anybody just type up the notes and send it to everybody?" And that's the time I mentioned, "Yeah, I've been typing notes. I'll send them to everybody here in a little bit." And at that point, he said, "I thought you were not paying attention. I thought you were just on the computer doing your own thing and you didn't care what I was saying. And I'm sorry for that." Right? So if you flip the roles, if you're a baby boomer or older generation and you're managing a younger generation, don't presume, right? You have to know that they work differently, and you have to recognize it, and don't presume. Ask a question if you see something. So if you're managing a younger generation, is communicate often and clearly, frank and frequent feedback. You must keep them challenged, right? The must keep them challenged piece of it is, this generation wants to know how they contribute to the overall goal. One. And then the second part is, this generation wants to know how they can advance. The average time they spend in a position is 2.5 years. So this generation, they keeping them challenged keeps them motivated to stay within the job, because they know they're contributing to the overall goal, and also that you're helping them grow so they can get the next job. Put the relationship before role. Here's where we talked about, I think David talked about the EQ versus IQ. This is the generation that The saying goes, they don't care what you know until they know that you care. So you have to make sure that you take time to understand and know the employee before you become that authoritative leader. Uh, Make flexibility a priority. Actually, a study shows with the net generation and the millennials, around 80% would prefer a remote working job versus a job that you have to show up to the office. So understand that flexibility is a priority. And if you don't work towards flexibility within your work group, if possible, then you'll start losing a lot of these employees to other work jobs that provide that flexibility. You have to motivate and empower these employees, right? Embrace their ideas as they challenge the status quo. Like I said, this is the Y generation, right? They come into the workplace, unlike their older generation, they're not timid. They don't have the mindset that I have to sit here and earn the right to ask a question. They'll ask the question the second day. So you as a manager, you shouldn't kill that spirit, that innovative spirit, right? You need to embrace their ideas. And if it's a bad idea, explain why, right? Just encourage them to bring those ideas and innovate your workplace. Adopt the role of a coach. I mentioned this earlier. You have to explain how what they do ties to the overall company goal. Gone are the days where employees just do what you ask because you ask them to do it. They have to see the bigger picture, and you have to explain what the bigger picture is. Update your performance appraisal process. Right now, in a lot of workplaces, it's once a year, maybe twice a year, right? You have to go to maybe even a weekly one-on-one meetings with the employees. You have to look into, am I actually doing a performance appraisal based on what success looks like in the new generation? Gone are the days where work is 9 to 5 or 8 to 4. Like just showing up to the office in itself is not productivity. You as a manager that's managing the new generation, to be actually successful, you have to look at what is high performance from a productivity standpoint, not from time that was spent on a certain project. How did they succeed? What did they contribute to the overall goal for the company? So, and I went through this a little fast, and I can answer any questions that y'all have. Um, the inevitable change part of this is the workplace is constantly changing, and actually is changing more frequently now than ever, right? And and as a manager, that dynamic has changed. Gone are the days where you're asking the employees to learn your style. You have to learn the employee for you to be successful. And you also have to know that an average employee nowadays, millennials, next generation, they're not loyal to the company. They want to stay at a position, average 2.5 years, and move on to something else. And a lot of managers are asking themselves, why should I invest time in an employee that's going to be here for 2 years? And the other saying that I found that makes a lot of sense is, it's better to train an employee and lose him than to not train him and just have him stay. So you have to have a method to create a sustainable, very speedy, getting an employee to be productive, highly productive actually, within a year and a half. So that by the 2 year mark, they're giving you their best. And if they give you another year, then you have the transitional space to get to the next employee. Looking at work as not a thing. Work is a thing. I'm sorry, not a place. You have to change your mindset. It's not that I see that employee there from 9 to 5. That's not work. It's what are they producing? And then the resilient leadership part of this is, don't sit there complaining. Don't sit there saying these employees like to be appreciated. They like to be congratulated for doing things that I pay them to do. No, you have to see the opportunity there, and you have to adapt to a way of succeeding with the changing environment that these newer generations bring into the workplace. That's all I got, Chris. And thank you, by the way. Thank you for the inviting me to this. And I'm honored to be presenting to y'all.